Yeah, what he's hinting at is that I'm currently head of staff of a government commission that it looks into the possibilities of making road transport fossil-free or climate neutral by 2050. But my background is partly also in shipping. I am a professor of environment system analysis at the Royal Institute of Technology. If you compare that with a medical doctor, I would call myself a general practitioner. So don't turn to me for surgery. That means I cannot go into all the technical details that a ship owner or a ship manager would be able to concerning some of these technologies that are now potential options for the future. But I do have a general background. I've worked with shipping issues for about 15 years, so I hope that I can address this issue. But I'm trying to do it in a systemized way, which means that you also need to look at what happens in other sectors of society that are also demanding petroleum-based fuels. We all know that shipping is growing fast, a bit slowed down currently by the recession in Europe and some other parts of the world. And it will meet increasingly more stringent emission requirements. The requirements on SO2 in the ECA areas is what is really facing us now, but there might in the future also be regulations concerning CO2 beyond what the IMO has already done on particulate matter and particularly on black carbon. Since soot being emitted, particularly in the northern regions, add to the climate effect when deposited on snow and ice. Currently, the global shipping area is contributing or is responsible for perhaps 3.4% of the global emissions of CO2. But if you compare instead with the total supply or demand for petroleum-based products, we are down to about 1/10 of the global market. It's still such that almost 50% of oil products are consumed in other sectors than transport. So it's important to understand that the focus of demand from other customers may shift over time. As oil products or the crude oil becomes more expensive, we could expect substitution for other types of fuel or other types of electricity production, for instance, in areas where substitution is relatively cheap. And that means, of course, that the transport sector's total part of demand will increase over time. And we see in some of the OECD countries that we are above 70% for transportation or even approaching 80%. So there is an ongoing process. But this also means that it has an impact on crude oil prices because so many things are happening on the side of the users that will have an impact on balance between supply and demand. And that means that we should not be too sure about peak oil, or if peak oil happens, it's not going to be a dramatic decline in supply. It's going to be probably a rather smooth adaptation to new conditions. All of you know all of this, so I don't think that I should spend many words on talking about the upcoming new sulfur limits. Of course, there is some uncertainty, particularly concerning the 0.5% limit globally applied, when that will happen. And there is now, since the spring of this year, also some doubts being casted on the Tier 3 in nitrogen ECAs, which should have turned into force in 2016. But whereas you know, Russia has now, together with some other members of the IMO, called for this to be postponed by 5 years. And it's also essential to understand that Tier 3 applies only in the NECA areas. And so far, there are no NECAs being decided upon in Europe. And where the Baltic Sea is concerned, Russia is a major player again. So even if the IMO decides to postpone this start by 5 years, in my view, there is some uncertainty whether Russia at that time will be willing to participate in the formation of a Baltic Sea NECA. I'm going into fuels very shortly, but I'd like to remind myself and all of you that the first step to be considered in shipping should be to see if you have feasible options for reducing fuel consumption, because that means that whatever fuel you decide to run upon or to use, you would consume less of it. And I think there is ample room for efficiency improvement in the shorter term within the Ship Energy Efficiency Management Plan, and in the longer term for new builds, maybe cutting fuel consumption in new ships by as much as 30 or 40%. Slow steaming might also be considered, particularly on long hauls, and I will come back to that a little later. It's important to understand, and I'm sure that anybody who has been in the shipping industry for a while understands this, that ships are not mass-produced, they are individuals. They are different types, with different types of machinery. They have not always very much empty space on board. They may be traveling in ECA areas only to a limited part of their overall use. They may have a short remaining expected life. In some cases, of course, many years remain. And one would also in the short term have to consider the lack of mature new technologies and also shortcomings when it comes to fuel delivery infrastructure. But in the longer term, new technologies will develop, and I'm quite sure that we will see positive learning curves which would contribute to reducing the incremental costs and also in some cases economies of scale as you start producing for a larger market the equipment needed on board. These are, as far as I can see, and listening to some of the other speakers yesterday, seem to be identifying the same kind of options. Heavy fuel oil in combination with scrubbers, and if there is a Tier 3 requirement, also with SCR. Marine gas oil or diesel oil would require SCR as well for nitrogen oxide. LNG, particularly in a vessel running entirely on LNG and not a dual fuel application, would not require as much of technologies on board for reducing NOx. The similar situation occurs for methanol or DME. I'm going to touch a little bit on Fischer-Tropsch diesel, which is synthetic diesel, which is quite feasible to produce, but very expensive. And I'd like to remind us that in all cases, and particularly in over longer journeys, there are possible combinations with support from wind. Starting with scrubber technologies, they may remove substantially more than 95 or 90% of SO2 and 80-90% of particulate matter. Even if particulate matter is not a regulated exhaust substance currently, it's a very important contribution, particularly in coastal areas to reduce PM emissions. The cost of the equipment currently is in the range of $3 to $5 million, depending on the size of the ship, and it's less costly for new builds. And it also affects the operating costs. There has been one real long-term trial with the MV Ficaria Seaways, and it's interesting now, after more than 10,000 hours of testing, that the owner has, in the recent few months, decided to order scrubbers for an additional 12 ships. They wouldn't do that, of course, unless they felt that the technology was reliable. I can also see that Alfa Laval, which is the other main supplier of scrubber technology, has also a growing order book. There are an additional 3 or 4 other suppliers in Europe and North America. Wärtsilä is also seen its stock expand over the last few months. This was a figure that I found on their website a few months ago. And here is the pioneering Ro-Ro ship from DFDS. But the market is not yet fully confident in scrubber technology. Many ship owners complain that the current experience is too limited. They complain sometimes over lack of space on board. I noticed that Wärtsilä had done a feasibility study looking over 200 ships and found that very few of them had a real problem with finding the space on board. There may still be some uncertainty concerning port reception facilities, and there is an uncertainty also concerning the IMO guidelines for the permissible pH level, which is currently set at 6.5, but there are some discussions on lowering this, making it more acid, the discharge in an open loop scrubber. I go on to LNG. Over the past 10 years, almost all, or at least 85% of all LNG carriers have started using excess boil-off gas to propel the vessels. In addition, there are now more than 30, perhaps even exceeding 40, I'm not quite up to date with that, of mostly smaller vessels using LNG. A majority of them are in Norway. Greenhouse gas emissions are cut by 10 to 20% depending on the lower content of carbon in natural gas compared to oil. But that might partly be offset by releases of methane. So the methane slip needs to be very small in order to come out with a positive figure compared to oil. And there has been some concern, particularly in the retrofitting of older vessels to dual fuel, while the new ships now being marketed, for instance, engines by Diesel and MAN and Wärtsilä, they report much, much lower figures. LNG does not give rise to any particulate matter and or black carbon, and the sulfur emissions are far below 0.1%, so it's very, very little, and NOx can be taken care of by EGR and does not require a catalyst reduction. This is the Viking Grace, which I think is the, apart from the LNG carriers, the largest ship so far to run on LNG, but this is a dual fuel engine in operation between Turku in Finland and Stockholm since January this year. There are also problems connected to LNG, no surprise. It adds in a new ship 20-25% on the capital cost. Storage requires cryogenic tanks in order to be able to keep the gas in a liquid stage, and this consumes about 3 times the space compared to traditional fuel oil tanks. So you need space for this on board. In my view, that might be something that make owners of large ships hesitant. In the case of the Viking Grace, they can fuel up on each return trip, which is rather short, so they don't need to devote large capacity to the tanks. But someone running a container ship from China to Europe would have to give up some space, which otherwise might have been used for containers. The handling costs of LNG are higher compared to liquid fuels, and the gas delivery infrastructure is still at least partly lacking, although a number of projects are underway in Norway. They've started early in Norway, but in other parts of Western Europe and also in Far East Asia and to some degree in the United States and Canada. There are some safety precautions. I would say that the LNG safety record from transporting LNG in vessels is excellent. There hasn't not been any major accident at all. But now we're turning into a phase where LNG will be handled in many, many more places, and this requires some skills from the person doing it, and safety precautions have to be taken, and in some cases they are loading in ports very close to residential areas. And there is still some dispute over whether you should be allowed or not be allowed to bunker in port while you have passengers on board. In the case of Stockholm, they have a barge coming up from the seaside of the vessel, so the Port of Stockholm thinks that that is sufficient while passengers and cars and lorries are handled on the other side of the vessel. Retrofitting to LNG, very expensive, viable, I believe, only for as dual fuel. There is, in my understanding, only one vessel that has turned to a complete reliance on LNG, a Norwegian smaller vessel. Methanol and DME has come up as potential alternatives to LNG. For use in existing engines, you would have to blend it with a pilot fuel, but it's enough with about 5% of diesel. You can adjust fuel tanks and other onboard equipment at relatively low cost. But you have to take account of the fact that the energy density of methanol is only half of that of diesel fuel. So you would either have to install bigger tanks or fill up twice as often. Methanol can be converted to DME on board by dehydration, and DME is a much better fuel from a number of aspects. It is not toxic, which is the case with methanol. It burns without giving any visible exhausts. It is extremely clean. It can be used in a conventional diesel engine. If you run the engines on methanol, however, you would need EGR to meet the Tier 3 limits. There is, I think, an ongoing trial now with Stena Line's Stena Scanrail for an auxiliary engine. It was postponed for a while last spring, but I guess that they are now doing this. And the idea is to try this in order to, in the next step, convert the Stena Germanica to run on methanol from next year. And they do have a long-term plan, I guess that is provisional on a success with the trials, to convert 25 existing ferries to run on methanol. It's also interesting to see that there is a second company considering to take this step. Canadian Waterfront Shipping has signed a letter of intent with Mann Diesel and Turbo for some engines that are to be run on methanol. Prior to that, it was only Stena Line that was interested in this. Here we see the Stena Germanica. It's a ship that is now 13 years old, but it has been rebuilt a couple of times. And of course, the idea here is that in a ship which may have only, say, 15 remaining years in operation, you would like to avoid having large costs on board for instance, retrofitting to LNG, while the lower onboard cost for methanol might make sense. I mentioned briefly Fischer-Tropsch diesel, which is synthetically produced from natural gas or hard coal. There are some relatively large plants using excess gas in Qatar, but the conversion gives rise to large energy losses, and the yield in terms of Fischer-Tropsch diesel falls below 50%. So this is quite expensive, and it does not solve the issue with NOx. So I regard this as a very unlikely choice for ships, more likely in the road sector where the willingness to pay is higher and where restrictions are more severe. Then, of course, you need to look at the short and long-term impact of economic conditions. It's important to know that where heavy fuel oil is concerned, it used to be about 20% of oil production that turned out as residual oil. But refineries have improved their ways of making use of crude oil, so it's now down to around 10%. But there is not fierce competition for this because you can see more and more land-based installations that turn to natural gas, particularly in North America with the fracking of gas. So my belief is that heavy fuel oil will still be available at a modest price compared to distillate fuels. For distillate fuels, you have fierce competition with land-based modes. The aviation Jet A1 fuel is also close enough in the distillation process to be a competing market. And we have an imbalance in Europe in the sense that we use much more distillate fuels than we produce. So we are net importers from Russia and other parts of the former Soviet Union, from Turkey and from the United States. But there is also ongoing investment in refineries in those countries, particularly on the eastern side of us, that will increase supply probably already in 2014 and 15. There is abundant supply of natural gas, but of differing qualities. Natural gas is not a commodity which is exactly the same delivered from every type of place. So you need to know what you are buying and to adjust your engines to it and pay for what you get and nothing more. And there is a large regional variation in LNG prices currently. The American industry wants to have a go ahead from the government, from the federal government, to become a exporter of LNG. And if that happens, we will have more of an international market, will also have an impact on pricing in Europe. Methanol, it's important to understand that this is a real large industrial commodity. So it's in place all over the world. It's handled in most large ports. So access to methanol is not a problem. These figures are a bit old, but I think that the difference in prices are still about the same. You have them in US dollar per ton, but also to make it easier to compare in US dollars per megawatt hour. And it's important to understand that this is LNG handled in Rotterdam. It's not LNG to the ship in Gothenburg or in another port, because there are handling costs that would rise the total cost a bit. And there is a bigger difference in that respect compared to methanol and the traditional fuels. So what should we expect from short term? I can see now a growing interest in efficiency improvements in the existing fleet because of the market is not so good currently. There's also an interest in slow steaming. And this may together reduce fuel demand quite a bit. We see now a fast increase in scrubber installations, but most ship owners have not reacted in time for 2015, considering the time that it takes to deliver and to install. There will be no serious shortage of MGO. Prices may temporarily rise. I see only a slow increase in LNG in absolute numbers, even if the increase rate in percentage is considerable. Methanol might be an option for existing ships with relatively many remaining years in operation. And my personal guess is that by 2020 we will see about 10 times as many scrubber installations as we see ships converting to LNG. But after 2020, this may change, but I don't expect a major movement. It could still be a few hundred, which is a lot more than the current 40, but there will be more installations of scrubbers, I'm quite certain. Also as a means of meeting the European requirement for 0.5% sulfur in 2020 and the possibility of a worldwide limit. One thing that I believe that the shipping industry should be a bit concerned about is the possibility of non-compliance in 2015. I heard the head of the DFDS, the CEO, saying when they decided to go further with another 12 vessels that he didn't really see the technical risk, but certainly the political risk of being an early mover. And if governments or the IMO provides possibilities for those who did not move to be exempt for some while after 1st of January 2015, that is of course going to be a penalty on those who moved early. So in my view, it's really crucial to level the playing field and to protect those early movers from any kind of derogation. And the way to do it, if it happens, would be to enforce a penalty which is at least equal to the cost difference between MGO and whatever other fuel that the non-complying ship is using. And to have that possibility running for some time until you can see that the market is able to provide MGO to the full extent needed. Now, beyond 2020, there are numerous uncertainties here. Will the new sulfur limit apply in 2020 or later? Will there be any NECA areas in Europe? And when will they come into force? Of course, this has an impact on whether you want to for instance, go for LNG. Because LNG, you will have a benefit from being able to, at low cost, or at almost no additional cost to meet the Tier 3. But if Tier 3 doesn't happen, of course, then that does not provide any additional benefit to LNG. It's also an open issue of whether the IMO will be able to enforce any kind of market-based instrument that will affect shipping, which would also give an advantage to LNG. But my belief, and I could be wrong, I mean, this is a bit of guesswork to be honest, is that LNG will be a common choice in short sea shipping, in new builds, while heavy fuel oil and scrubbers will remain an option for some that are not so frequent visitors to SECA areas and in the open seas trade. Methanol and DME in the longer term, this is an interesting issue because I can see that Stena is right in going for methanol and DME in the short term in ships which are already existent and with some remaining life but not completely new. But this is really provisional on a really low gas price. Because what you need to be able to pay for the incremental cost compared to LNG that comes from the fact that when you produce methanol from natural gas, there is a 30% energy loss. That could become smaller in the future if the shipping industry accepts a methanol grade which is not quite as fine as the one which is required by the chemical industry. But it's still a substantial loss, and that should be compared to the 7 or 8% which is the loss for liquefying natural gas into LNG. On the other side, you have the cheaper, the lower cost of fuel handling to the ship and also on board the ship, which is a substantial difference. But these have to balance each other. And my expectation is that the gas price is critically important for methanol. It has to stay low. It might, but if it starts growing, then there will not be as much room for methanol. Then a ship owner would prefer LNG without turning it into methanol or DME. Biofuels, well, technically it's possible to produce biofuels that can replace the oils used by the shipping industry, but you would have to expect a incremental cost compared to marine gas oil of at least 60%. So I don't see that any ship owner is willing to do this. It would take a very high price on CO2 to make them take this step. And if there is a much higher price, I think wind is more likely as a partial response to higher prices compared to buying biofuels, with the possible exception that some ship owner who wants to do a little bit for PR decides on a low blend of 3 or 5%, then that they can carry. I mentioned already the uncertainties concerning future climate policy and the inability of the IMO to take a decision on market-based instruments. The EU has threatened now several times to take unilateral action, but there is a huge hesitance in the community to actually do this. But sooner or later, I expect that there will be some kind of market-based instrument that has an impact on fuel costs. And I do believe that the black carbon issue is going to become increasingly important, particularly in the northern part of the hemisphere, and those closest to the Arctic area. I touched a bit on slow steaming. Maybe I should say optimal speed rather than slow steaming, but in many cases, optimal speed might mean that you reduce speed a bit, or that you, in the ordering of new builds, go for a slightly lower design speed, so that you're optimizing the engines and the ship to a lower speed. And of course, to what extent this is a good idea from an economic point of view depends on what kind of ship you're talking about. But I think it's particularly interesting for those with low manning costs and for those that are on long journeys, perhaps also for some feeders. Final slide. I'd like to remind us all that we are indeed living in an ever-changing world. I'm sure that if we look 15 years ahead, there will be existing technologies to develop further. There will be new technologies that none of us has a more than potential a little idea about, but which may be underway. Efficiency will improve. There are also some new technologies that are not too far away from commercialization. You have to warn again, of course, when I talk about long-term crude oil and heavy fuel oil prices, that is in a world that does not go to war. So political conflict may at least temporarily influence fuel supply and fuel prices. And I don't think we have seen the end of the debate over climate change. If we see again a rising global temperature, now it has slowed down a bit, or rising sea levels, or if the ices of Greenland are starting to melt faster, that would certainly trigger new policies. And given the life of a new vessel of 25 or 30 years, quite a bit can happen in those years. So the ship owner needs to consider also the economy of the ship as it approaches the end of its life. Thank you. I'm sailing mainly without any engine power.
Thank you very much. We have some time for questions, and I turn immediately to you, Kelly.
I appreciate this was a European-focused presentation, but I'm wondering, have you cast your eyes over to what's going on in Asia? Do you have a view? For instance, in Singapore, they're investing very heavily in LNG pumping infrastructure, etc.
I think I touched upon it in just one sentence earlier on. And it is true that Singapore, Hong Kong, and Korea, and parts of China are taking a great interest in LNG. And there are also discussions over ECAs being introduced in that area would, of course, would also provide support to a shift to LNG. On the other hand, the LNG price in Japan or in that part of the world is substantially higher than that in Europe, and much, much higher than the price in North America. But it seems still to be a viable option, and that would certainly have an influence also on Europe in the longer term if Asia becomes a strong first mover.
Yes, please.
Yeah, first of all, thanks. It was a very nice general overview. One kind of dimension which I would like to touch upon is safety.
Mm-hmm.
Especially when it comes to methanol, there's a lot of debate about the safety of that. And we all remember that about 10 years ago, LNG in the US was under a huge safety pressure. Mm-hmm. Now, of course, when it's domestic, it's the other way around. And how do you see safety from different angles into this?
I do notice that there are not yet regulations in place for either of the two. The LNG procedure has gone further and is likely to result in a regulation relatively soon, but we still have uncertainty concerning bunkering of ships with passengers on board, for instance. And as I said, the safety record so far has been very good. But on the other hand, if you compare this to methanol, methanol is handled in millions of tons worldwide in ports, not perhaps close to houses where people live, and not used as a fuel for propelling ships. It is toxic, it is flammable, but I cannot really see that that should be a real obstacle. But certainly there needs to be a regulation in place. And so long as the regulation is not in place, there will be uncertainty concerning whether this fuel is a real option or not. I don't know if there's anyone from Stena here who can tell us how Stena views the safety issues concerning methanol.
Yeah, sorry if I mean.
Yeah.
Actually, I would like to hear from you. How do you see, is it politically, from a political point of view, is it acceptable to have kind of a methanol which can be dangerous? If you think from that angle, what's the public opinion going to be at the end of the day?
Well, trying to see this from the point of view of a layman, I think that any accident with LNG that results in an explosion or LNG being on the water surface might set back the industry, because that would certainly create turmoil. I have difficulty seeing that methanol could create an incident that would affect the public opinion to the same extent. But again, I mean, now we are into details where I'm not knowledgeable enough to be able to provide a full answer.
Thank you. Marcus?
Thank you very much. Very interesting and very clear. But could you comment shortly about what's happening in the United States and Canada? They are taking on the ECA and SECA, as I understand it. And what is something about the debate in...
I'm following this at remote distance, so I don't know so much about the details. But one major difference to Europe is that the SECAs are narrow. It's 200 nautical miles, and that of course means that fuel switching is much more of an option compared to having two large neighboring SECAs in Europe. And beyond that, I think that the gas issue is going to grow in North America so long as the prices are staying so very low. That's certainly going to, but that's mainly for short sea shipping, at least in the short term.
Yes.
Do you have any views on the enforceability of the seekers and meekers? I.e., at the moment, I think the way that the regime is set up, the incentive for non-compliance outweighs the incentive for compliance. From a financial standpoint, the risk of being caught is such that you might as well take your chance, and if you're caught, the fine is so minimal that actually it's very, very pragmatic.
Yeah. I'm happy that you bring out this issue, because it's not only the size of the penalty, but also the risk of getting caught if you're not an honest guy. says that we are in difficulties, we couldn't buy the MGO we needed. And of course, the states around the Baltic Sea and the North Sea should really look into what they can do in order to at least make it more difficult for anyone to cheat. And if I am right in thinking that MGO is not going to be it's still going to be a huge price premium compared to heavy fuel oil, but that there will be an availability and that the price is not going to rise considerably. And if ship owners become more confident in scrubber technologies, there will happen quite a bit of investment and change in 2015 to maybe 17. So I envisage a relatively short period when there might be difficulties that would have to lead to derogations. And of course, there are also risks connected to the last of December next year, because even if the world market can supply us for MGO, there needs to be cleaned tanks that can shift over from heavy fuel oil to marine gas oil. And that cannot instantly be done on New Year's Eve. So there will have to be some preparations and hopefully some discussions among customers and providers so that this happens smoothly.
I understood that you're optimistic about the new technologies developed. This is based, I understand, on what you see is going on in industry, in research centers and so on. In what part of the world is this more intense than in others?
Well, I can see one cluster is in Scandinavia, obviously. The Norwegian NOx Fund has done a lot to promote trials and investment in LNG. If you look at who the providers of scrubber technology are, they are mainly Scandinavian companies as well. But it's also interesting to see what is going on in Korea and China. So there's also a cluster, particularly around LNG.
I have one more question. It is, you said that it is, methanol is a large commodity.
Mm-hmm.
And this is based on, of course, the transmission of gas to methanol. I understand. And you didn't mention the new sources of shale gas. How is this connected to each other?
Well, shale gas is natural gas, but as I said briefly, natural gas have differing content of methane depending on where it is produced. So you need to know what you're buying. Then, of course, natural gas or LNG can also be produced from, or methanol can be produced from hard coal. And then you create a real big greenhouse gas footprint. So I hope that Stena is not going to buy its methanol from that supply chain, but from natural gas, which was my assumption in the figures that I showed.
Okay. Yes, please. Yeah.
Thank you, Per. A very interesting presentation. And now we're looking at the shorter term, the sale gas and the introduction of that. But I know that you're also studying the transport sector in a wider perspective. And the options you showed here have mainly been fossil fuel based, apart from the biofuels, which will always be perhaps a smaller portion. If you look in a longer perspective, do you foresee that there will be a shift towards renewable fuels within the foreseeable future? Or is the introduction of shale gas and the low price of shale gas a factor which will postpone the transition into renewables?
This depends on two factors. The cost of traditional fuel, and my assumption was that we are not going to see a huge price increase, partly because of shale oil. The other one is if producers of biofuel can cut costs in the production chain, become more efficient, have smaller losses in the production of biofuels. But there's also limits to biofuel production. Scandinavians may not think that that's the case, but you only need to go down to Germany or Belgium to understand that there isn't an awful lot of forest residuals around. So it's not even sufficient for more than a fraction of the current demand or needs in the road transportation sector. If shipping is going for biofuel, I think it is likely to be what we call drop-in fuels, so that there are they're meeting the criteria needed from an engine point of view. This is done already with HVOs, which, for instance, the Preem refinery here blends with a traditional diesel fuel up to 30%, and they think they could even go up to 70% and still meet the European specification for diesel fuel.
You're assuming that the only renewable source is biofuels.
Yeah, what I didn't say, and that you remind me about that now, is that, of course, you could think of hydrogen in fuel cells, but the difficulty there is where to get the hydrogen from. And if it is produced from electricity or from natural gas, even if the fuel cell itself has an efficiency of perhaps up to 60%, it's difficult to beat marine engines, because that supply chain and the engine itself provides a relatively high efficiency from well to propeller. And the cost of electricity, of course, would also be very important in this case if you use electrolysis. And apart from that, then of course you can imagine lots of other future types of supply. I had algae in one of my slides, but this is far beyond my sight. I cannot say more about that. So we will be quite dependent on traditional fuels, but also with large possibilities of reducing fuel demand per vessel kilometer or nautic mile, and with some possibilities of wind support in some cases.
Okay, I think one last question, which is more personal. Do you have a relation to the ship?
It's mine.
Yeah. So, and this is sailing in the archipelago? Or?
This is in the Stockholm archipelago. For those who've never been there, it's 28,000 islands, and a very nice area for coastal sailing.
Thank you very much again.
Yep.